My name is Robert Harlan. I'm 78 years old, and I live in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I spent 47 years working with my hands, building houses, fixing what was broken, making things that would last longer than I would. That's what a man does. You build, you provide, you don't complain about it, and you don't expect medals for doing what's right. I raised my daughter Sarah after my wife Margaret passed from cancer when Sarah was only 12. Sarah had Tommy Young at 13, in circumstances we never discussed much, a quiet family matter that shaped us all. Then, when life took Sarah and her husband too soon, I raised their boy Tommy from the time he was 8 years old. I worked extra years when most men my age were fishing and watching game shows. I taught him how to swing a hammer, how to treat people with respect, how to look a man in the eye when you shake his hand. And 2 weeks before his wedding, that same boy stood in my kitchen and told me I didn't belong there. If you've ever given everything to your family, only to feel invisible when it mattered most, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you want to hear how this story ends, because what I discovered about why he said those words, it changed everything. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from and how long you've been following these stories. I'd like to know I'm not just talking to myself here. The day Tommy told me I wasn't welcome, I thought my heart might actually stop. Not from a heart attack. I'm too stubborn for that. But from the kind of pain that makes you wonder if everything you believed about loyalty and family was just a lie you told yourself to get through the hard years. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened and why it happened, because there's a lesson in this that every man my age needs to hear. See, we spend our whole lives being told that if you work hard, if you sacrifice, if you love your family and teach them right from wrong, it'll all mean something in the end, that they'll remember, that they'll honor what you gave. But sometimes the people closest to you forget where they came from, or worse, someone reminds them to forget. I'm not a man who cries easily. I buried my wife when I was 53. I buried my only daughter when I was 62. I've stood at gravesides and kept my composure because that's what men do. We carry the weight so others don't have to. But standing there in my kitchen, watching my grandson avoid my eyes and stumble over words that made no sense, I felt something crack inside me that I didn't know could break. This isn't a story about getting even. It's about what happens when you finally see the truth about people, the ones you love and the ones who pretend to love you back. It's about discovering that sometimes the person you think is family is just wearing the mask well. And it's about how the truth, when it finally comes out, doesn't always feel like victory. It feels like relief. I never thought the boy who cried into my shirt at his parents' funeral would one day look me in the eye and say I wasn't welcome. Tommy was 8 when I got the call. State police, icy roads, a semi that couldn't stop in time. My daughter Sarah and her husband Mark never made it to the hospital. The boy was at my house having a sleepover, something we did every Friday night. We'd been building a birdhouse in the garage when the officer knocked on my door. I remember kneeling down in front of Tommy, this skinny kid with his mother's eyes, and I had to tell him that his whole world had just ended. He didn't cry at first, just stared at me like he was waiting for the punchline. Then he collapsed into my chest and sobbed so hard I thought he might break his own ribs. I held him until he fell asleep. Then I held him longer, because I didn't know what else to do. There was never a question about where he'd go. I was 62, already planning my retirement, already looking forward to quiet mornings and long afternoons in the workshop. But you don't choose family based on convenience. You step up, and you do what needs doing. I enrolled him in the local school, packed his lunches, showed up to every parent-teacher conference, every baseball game, every school play where he had 2 lines and forgot one of them. I worked 3 more years past retirement to make sure there was money for his college fund, taught him carpentry in the evenings, how to measure twice and cut once, how to sand with the grain, how to respect the wood. He called me Pop, not Grandpa. Pop, said it felt right. We had a rhythm, him and me. Saturday mornings we'd go to the hardware store, and I'd let him pick out the project for the week. Sundays we'd go to church, then stop at the diner where Betty always gave him extra bacon. He'd tell me about girls he liked, ask advice about school, complain about teachers who didn't understand him. I listened. I guided. I never raised my voice unless it was necessary, and it almost never was. He was a good kid, polite, hardworking, respectful, the kind of young man who opened doors for elderly women and said, "Yes, sir," and "No, ma'am," without being prompted. People in town would stop me at the grocery store and tell me what a fine job I'd done. I'd nod and say thank you. But the truth was, I never felt like I'd done anything special. I just loved him. Simple as that. When he graduated high school, he gave a speech and thanked me in front of everyone. Said I'd given him a second chance at family when he thought he'd lost everything. I sat in that auditorium in my good suit, the one I'd bought for Sarah's funeral and hadn't worn since, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pride, pure and uncomplicated. He went off to college on a partial scholarship I'd helped supplement, called me every Sunday without fail, came home for holidays and summer breaks, brought his laundry, which I pretended to complain about, but secretly loved, because it meant he still needed me for something. By the time he turned 24, he'd become the kind of man I'd hoped he'd be. Steady job as an engineer, good friends, no trouble with the law or substances, or the kind of stupid decisions that ruin young lives. He'd taken the worst thing that could happen to a child and turned it into strength. I thought I'd done right by him, though I'd honored Sarah's memory by raising her boy into someone she'd be proud of. Though the bond between us was unbreakable, forged in tragedy, strengthened by years of showing up for each other, I was wrong about that last part. For the first time in years, I let myself believe the hardest days were behind us. Tommy called me on a Tuesday evening in March. I was in the garage, finishing a jewelry box I'd been making for the church raffle, when I heard his voice on the phone, higher pitched than usual, excited. "Pop, I've got news." He'd met a girl named Emily at work, a project manager with a laugh he said could light up a room. He sounded a bit more polished than usual, like he was trying on a new way of speaking. They'd been dating for a year and a half, and I'd met her twice. Sweet girl, polite, looked Tommy in the eye when she spoke to him, which I've always believed says something about character. "I asked her to marry me," he said, and she said yes. I set down my sandpaper and smiled, something that came easier than it used to. "Well, that's fine news, son. Real fine news. We're thinking of a September wedding, small ceremony, family and close friends. And Pop," he paused, and I could hear the emotion catching in his throat. "I want you standing beside me. Best man. You're the only father I've really known. I won't pretend I didn't get choked up. At 78, you've cried enough that you're not ashamed of it anymore, but you also don't do it lightly." This felt earned. "I'd be honored," I told him. "And there's something else." His excitement rushed back. "Remember how you always said a wedding should have something handmade, something that lasts? I want you to build the arch, the one Emily and I will stand under. I want it to be yours, full circle." That's what it felt like. I'd built the cradle Sarah slept in as a baby, built the birdhouse with Tommy the night before his world fell apart, and now I'd build the arch where he'd start his own family. I said yes before he'd even finished asking. The next few months felt lighter than any I could remember. I sketched designs for the arch, bought cedar that would weather well, spent evenings in the garage measuring and cutting and sanding until my hands ached in that good, useful way. Tommy and Emily stopped by every couple weeks to check progress, and Emily would hug me and say it was going to be perfect. I bought a new suit, navy blue. The woman at the store said it made me look distinguished, which I figured was a polite way of saying old but presentable. I didn't care. I was going to stand beside my grandson and watch him marry a good woman, and I wanted to look the part. Tommy asked me to say a few words at the reception. I started writing them down. Nothing fancy, just some thoughts about love and commitment and the importance of showing up even when it's hard, about how marriage is like carpentry. It takes patience, attention to detail, and a willingness to fix what breaks instead of throwing it away. Everything felt right, the kind of right you don't question, because you've lived long enough to know how rare it is. I should have known better. In my experience, when life feels that smooth, it's usually because you're standing on ice that hasn't cracked yet. 2 weeks before the wedding, Tommy called and asked if he could stop by. Said he needed to talk about something important. His voice sounded different, tight, nervous. I figured maybe he was getting cold feet, needed some reassurance from an old man who'd been married for 31 years before cancer took that away. I told him to come by any time, made a pot of coffee, set out the cookies from the bakery he used to love as a kid, and I waited, completely unaware that the boy I'd raised was about to break something I didn't know could be broken. I'll never forget standing in my own kitchen when my grandson said, "You don't belong at my wedding." He'd arrived just after 6. I'd been watching the news, waiting, the coffee already cold in the pot, because I'd made it an hour too early. When I opened the door, Tommy wouldn't quite meet my eyes. That should have been my first warning. "Come in, son," I said. "Coffee's ready." He shook his head. "I'm fine, Pop. I can't stay long." We stood there in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd taught him how to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl, where we'd eaten 1,000 breakfasts together, where he'd done his homework at the table while I cooked dinner. The evening light came through the window the way it always did, soft and golden, making everything look warmer than it actually was. "So what's on your mind?" I asked. "Pre-wedding jitters?" Tommy looked down at his hands. 30 seconds of silence, then another 30. I've lived long enough to know that when someone can't find words, it's because the words they have are going to hurt. "Pop, He stopped, started again. "Emily and I have been talking about the wedding, about the guest list and seating and everything." I nodded, waiting. My heart was already starting to speed up, some animal instinct warning me that danger was coming, but not knowing from where. "We've decided," his voice cracked slightly. "We think it's best if you don't come to the wedding." The clock on the wall kept ticking. Outside, someone's dog was barking. Normal sounds in a moment that had just stopped being normal. "What?" It was all I could manage. "You don't belong there," he said, finally looking at me. His eyes were red around the edges, but his jaw was set. "It's complicated, Pop, but it's what's best for everyone." I felt my hands grip the edge of the counter, not out of anger, not yet, out of need for something solid to hold on to while the floor seemed to shift beneath me. "Tommy," my voice sounded strange to my own ears, too calm. "I've been building your wedding arch for 4 months. You asked me to stand beside you. You called me the only father you've known." "I know." He wouldn't look at me again. "I'm sorry. I really am. But this is how it has to be." "Why?" The word came out harder than I intended. "Give me one reason that makes sense." He opened his mouth, closed it, shook his head. "Is this Emily?" I asked. "Did she?" "No," he said, quickly. "This is my decision. Mine and Emily's together. Please don't make this harder than it already is." Harder than it already is? As if telling a man he's not welcome at his grandson's wedding after raising him from childhood could be easy. "I need you to leave," I said quietly. Tommy looked like he wanted to say something else, but he just nodded, turned, and walked out. I heard his car start, heard it back out of the driveway, heard it disappear down the street until there was nothing left but silence. I stood in that kitchen for an hour, didn't move, didn't sit down, just stood there, trying to make sense of what had happened. 10 years of raising him, 16 years of being there for every milestone, every scraped knee, every broken heart and hard decision. And now, I didn't belong. The coffee pot sat on the counter, still full. The cookies I'd set out looked ridiculous now, childish, like I'd been trying to bribe affection from someone who'd already decided I wasn't worth keeping around. I thought about Sarah, about what she'd think if she could see this, about whether I'd failed her by not raising her son to understand loyalty. Then I thought about something else, something that made my chest tighten with a different kind of pain. Tommy said it was complicated, said I didn't belong, but he wouldn't say why, wouldn't even try to explain. And in my 78 years, I've learned that when someone won't give you a reason, it's usually because the real reason is something they're ashamed to say out loud. I just didn't know yet what that reason was, or who had put it in his head. A man can fix a broken beam easier than a broken heart. I've spent decades repairing what's broken. Split wood, cracked foundations, doors that won't hang straight. You identify the problem, you gather your tools, you do the work. Simple, logical, the kind of problem solving that makes sense. But there's no tool for what I felt in the days after Tommy left my kitchen. No hammer to drive out the hurt. No sandpaper to smooth away the questions that kept me awake at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling while the house settled around me in the dark. I'd lie there replaying every conversation we'd had over the past year, searching for the moment I'd said or done something wrong. Maybe I'd been too pushy about the arch design. Maybe I'd embarrassed him somehow in front of Emily. Maybe I'd become the kind of old man who tells the same stories too many times and doesn't realize he's become a burden instead of a blessing. The worst part wasn't the rejection itself. I've been rejected before, by women before Margaret, by jobs I didn't get, by life in general more times than I can count. You learn to handle it. You move forward. The worst part was not knowing why. When Sarah died, at least I understood what had happened. Tragic, unfair, but clear. When Margaret got sick, the doctors gave us reasons. Medical terms I couldn't pronounce but could at least accept as fact. There was something to point to, something that made terrible sense in a terrible way. This was different. This was my grandson looking at me and deciding I wasn't worth an explanation, as if 16 years of my life raising him had earned me nothing, not even the dignity of truth. I stopped going to the diner on Sundays. Betty asked about Tommy once, and I told her he was busy with wedding planning. She smiled and said how exciting it must be. I nodded and left before she could ask more questions. My neighbor Frank noticed I wasn't sitting on the porch in the evenings like I usually did, knocked on my door one afternoon with a 6-pack of beer and an offer to watch the Phillies game. I thanked him and said I wasn't feeling social. He gave me a look, the kind men give each other when they know something's wrong but respect you enough not to pry. You know where I am if you need anything, he said. I appreciated that. Some men talk too much. Frank understood that sometimes a man needs to work through his pain alone, in his own time, in his own way. I tried calling Tommy twice. Both times I hung up before it connected. What would I even say? Beg him to reconsider? Demand an explanation he'd already made clear he wouldn't give? I'd raised him to be independent, to make his own decisions, to stand by his choices. I couldn't fault him for doing exactly what I'd taught him, even if those choices cut me to the bone. The wedding arch sat in my garage, half finished. I couldn't bring myself to work on it, but I couldn't bring myself to dismantle it either. It just sat there under a drop cloth, a monument to hope that had turned out to be foolish. At night, the quiet was heaviest. No phone calls from Tommy, no plans to look forward to. Just me in a house that felt bigger and emptier than it ever had. Even in the years right after Margaret passed, I thought about Tommy as a boy, the way he'd fallen asleep on my shoulder during long car rides, the way he'd laugh at my terrible jokes, the way he'd ask me to check for monsters in his closet, even though he was too old to really believe in them, the trust in his eyes when I'd promised him everything would be okay after his parents died. I'd kept that promise. I'd made sure everything was okay. I'd given him stability, guidance, love, everything a boy needs to grow into a good man. And now I was the one being shut out, like I was the monster he'd finally learned to stop believing in. I've never been a man who indulges in self-pity, but lying there in the dark, listening to the clock tick away the hours until dawn, I allowed myself to feel it. The deep, aching unfairness of it all. The bone-tired sadness of realizing that love and sacrifice don't guarantee loyalty, that you can give someone your whole heart, and they can still decide it's not worth keeping. By the time the sun came up each morning, I'd push it back down, make coffee, go through the motions, but the question never left me. Why? Sometimes the truth hides in plain sight, right between the nails and the 2x4s. I needed wood glue, simple errand, the kind of thing I'd done 1,000 times without thinking. But I'd been avoiding town, avoiding the chance of running into people who'd ask about the wedding, forcing me to either lie or explain something I didn't understand myself. By the second week, I'd run out of excuses to stay home. So I drove to Morrison's Hardware on a Thursday morning when I figured most people would be at work. I was wrong about the timing. I'd just grabbed the glue and was heading toward the register when I heard my name. Robert, haven't seen you in a while. It was Bill Morrison, who'd owned the store for 40 years and knew every regular customer by name. Good man. Honest. The kind who'd always throw in a couple extra screws for free if you were a penny short. Been keeping busy, I said, which wasn't exactly a lie. Busy replaying my failures. Busy not sleeping. That counts. I'll bet. A big wedding is coming up, right? Tommy and that lovely girl, Emily? My chest tightened, but I kept my face neutral. That's right. Saw them in here about a week ago with her folks. Picking out fixtures for their new place, I think. Her father's quite the character. Richard Caldwell. You met him yet? I shook my head. Haven't had the pleasure. Bill rang up my glue, and I could tell he wanted to say more. He had that look people get when they're deciding whether to share information that might be crossing a line. Caldwell's a big developer, Bill said finally. Built those luxury condos over on Riverside. Drives a Mercedes. Wears suits that probably cost more than my truck. He paused. Seems like the kind of man who likes things a certain way, if you know what I mean. I didn't know what he meant. Not exactly, but I nodded anyway. Tommy seemed different with them around, Bill continued, handing me my change. Quieter, real polite, but almost too polite, you know, like he was being careful. Careful how? Bill shrugged. Hard to explain. Just got the sense that Caldwell's the type who has opinions about everything, and everyone around him knows it. I thanked him and left, but his words stuck with me on the drive home. I'd never met Emily's parents. Tommy had mentioned them in passing, said her father was successful. Her mother was involved in charity work. I'd figured I'd meet them at the wedding, shake Richard Caldwell's hand, make small talk about the weather, and how beautiful the ceremony was. Now I was wondering if that was ever the plan at all. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the truck for a few minutes. Engine off, just thinking. Tommy had always been independent, sure, but he'd never been the type to cut people out without reason. He'd been raised to talk through problems, to face things head on, to treat people with respect even when it was hard. But Bill's observation nagged at me. Tommy acts differently around the Caldwells. Be careful. Almost like he was performing instead of being himself. I thought about the phone call when Tommy told me about the engagement, how excited he'd sounded, how genuine. That was my boy, the real him. But the Tommy who'd stood in my kitchen 2 weeks ago and told me I didn't belong, that had felt rehearsed, wooden, like he was delivering lines someone else had written. I wanted to dismiss the thought. I wanted to believe Tommy had made his own decision, even if I disagreed with it. Giving him credit for his choices had always been part of respecting him as a man, but respect works both ways, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the boy I'd raised wouldn't have done this without outside pressure. Not the Tommy who'd thanked me in his graduation speech, not the Tommy who'd called me the only father he'd ever really known. Someone had gotten to him. Someone had convinced him that his grandfather, a simple carpenter from a modest home, was an embarrassment instead of a blessing. And I had a growing suspicion about who that someone might be. The boy, who once wrote me Father's Day cards in crayon, now sent me a letter colder than January wind. It arrived on a Saturday, plain white envelope, my name and address typed instead of handwritten. No return address. I knew it was from Tommy before I even opened it. I could feel it the way you can feel a storm coming before the first drops fall. I stood at the mailbox for a long moment, holding that envelope, debating whether to read it or tear it up unread. Part of me thought if I didn't open it, I could preserve some small hope that this was all a misunderstanding that would eventually clear itself up. But I've never been a coward, so I walked back inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened it. The letter was short, 3 paragraphs, typed, formal as a business memo. Pop, I know. You're confused and hurt by my decision. I wish I could explain it in a way that would make sense to you. But the truth is, this is something Emily and I have decided together, and we both believe it's for the best. I need you to respect our wishes and not attend the wedding. I hope someday you'll understand that this isn't about what you did or didn't do. It's about what's right for us as we start our new life together. I wish you well, Tommy. I read it 3 times, then a 4th, looking for warmth, for some crack in the formality that would show me the boy I'd raised was still in there somewhere. There wasn't any. I wish you well, like I was a distant acquaintance instead of the man who'd held him through nightmares, who'd taught him to tie his shoes and drive a car and treat women with respect. Like 16 years of my life had been reduced to a polite dismissal. What struck me hardest wasn't even the rejection. It was the emptiness of it. No specific reason, no acknowledgement of what we'd been to each other. Just vague phrases that said everything and nothing at once. What's right for us as we start our new life together? That line gutted me, because it implied that I was part of the old life, something to be left behind like outgrown clothes or childhood toys. Disposable, inconvenient, not worth carrying forward into whatever shiny new existence Tommy and Emily were building. I set the letter down and stared at it. My hands were steady, but inside I felt something fundamental shift. The confusion was still there, but now it was mixed with something sharper. Anger. Not the hot, explosive kind. I'm too old for that. The cold, clarifying kind that makes you see things you'd been too hopeful to notice before. Tommy hadn't called, hadn't visited again, had sent a typed letter like he was terminating a contract, not severing a bond that had literally kept him alive when his world fell apart. That wasn't the boy I'd raised. That was someone else wearing his name. I thought about responding. I considered writing my own letter, pouring out everything I felt, the hurt, the confusion, the desperate need to understand what had changed. But what would be the point? He'd made it clear he didn't want to explain. I didn't think I was owed that much, so I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and placed it in the drawer with the old bills and expired warranties, filed away, dealt with. But dealt with isn't the same as forgotten. That letter sat in my mind like a splinter you can't quite dig out. Small, sharp, persistently painful. I found myself reading between the lines, analyzing the phrasing like it was some kind of puzzle I could solve if I just looked hard enough. Something Emily and I have decided together. Why emphasize together unless one of them needed convincing? What's right for us as we start our new life? Who talks about starting a new life like it requires erasing the people who got you there? The more I examined those words, the more they sounded like justifications, like Tommy was trying to convince himself as much as me. And that gave me the smallest, most painful sliver of hope. Because if he had to convince himself, maybe he didn't fully believe it. Maybe somewhere under all that formal distance, the real Tommy, my Tommy, was still there, just buried under someone else's expectations. It wasn't just my grandson speaking those cruel words. Someone else was pulling the strings. The truth started coming in pieces, the way it often does in a small town. A comment here, a meaningful look there. People who cared about me tried to help without directly betraying Tommy's confidence. The first real piece came from Dorothy Chen, who'd been Sarah's friend and had known Tommy since he was born. She stopped by on a Tuesday afternoon with a casserole, her standard response to any crisis, whether it was a death, a divorce, or apparently a family falling apart. We sat on the porch with coffee, and she didn't waste time with small talk. "Have you met the Caldwells yet?" she asked. "No." She nodded, like that confirmed something. "I have. I met them at a fundraiser last month. Richard and Patricia. They're a particular kind of people." I waited. Dorothy had always been diplomatic, which meant when she struggled for words, what she really meant was usually worse than what she said. "Patricia told me they're thrilled about the wedding," Dorothy continued, "but she mentioned several times that Emily is marrying up. Her word, not mine. Said Tommy comes from such a different background, and how wonderful it is that he's made something of himself despite his humble beginnings." My jaw tightened. Humble beginnings. She meant it. As a compliment, I think. But the way she said it, Dorothy shook her head. It wasn't kind, Robert. It was condescending. Like Tommy was some charity project who'd finally learned to use the right fork. I stared out at the street, watching a neighbor kid ride his bike in circles. She say anything else? Just that they're planning quite the event. Very exclusive guest list. High society types. She seemed concerned about making sure everything was appropriate for their social circle. Dorothy reached over and squeezed my hand. I'm sorry, Robert. I think you're being kept away because they're ashamed of where Tommy came from, and I think Tommy's letting them do it. After Dorothy left, I sat on that porch for another hour, her words settling over me like dust after a demolition. Ashamed of where he came from, ashamed of me. The second piece came from Frank next door, who'd heard from his wife, who'd heard from her book club that Richard Caldwell had been overheard at the country club talking about his future son-in-law. Apparently, he'd told someone that Tommy was rough around the edges but trainable, and that the wedding would be a more refined affair than what he's probably used to. Trainable, like Tommy was a dog that needed housebreaking. The final piece came from Bill at the hardware store when I went back for sandpaper. He pulled me aside near the paint aisle where no one else could hear. Listen, he said quietly. I probably shouldn't tell you this, but my wife's cousin works at the country club where the Caldwells are members. She overheard Richard Caldwell talking to Tommy last week, told him that certain family members might make the other guests uncomfortable, said something about not wanting his daughter embarrassed by people who don't understand the social expectations of this kind of event. My hands clenched around the sandpaper package hard enough to dent it. I'm sorry, Robert, Bill said, but I thought you should know. This wasn't Tommy's idea. He's being pressured. I thanked Bill and left before the anger showed on my face, because it wasn't just anger anymore. It was clarity, the kind that burns through confusion and leaves only hard truth behind. Richard Caldwell had looked at his daughter's fiancé and seen a project to be improved. He'd looked at Tommy's background, at me, at our modest life, at the fact that I worked with my hands instead of wearing expensive suits, and decided we weren't good enough for his family's reputation. And somehow, he'd convinced Tommy that I was an embarrassment, that showing up to the wedding would damage his new standing in a world where money and status mattered more than loyalty or love, or the 16 years a man spent raising a boy who wasn't even his biological responsibility. The worst part wasn't that Richard Caldwell was a snob. I'd met plenty of those in my life. You smile, you nod, you walk away, and you forget they exist. The worst part was that Tommy had listened to him, my grandson, the boy who used to fall asleep in my lap during Sunday afternoon football, who'd cried on my shoulder when his first girlfriend broke his heart, who'd told a whole auditorium that I'd given him a second chance at family, had chosen Richard Caldwell's approval over my presence, had chosen being accepted by people who measured worth in dollar signs over honoring the man who'd measured worth in showing up every single day. I sat in my truck in the hardware store parking lot and stared at nothing, trying to process what I'd learned. Part of me wanted to march to wherever Tommy was living now and tell him exactly what I thought of his new father-in-law and the poison he'd been fed. But I didn't, because the ugly truth was, Tommy had a choice. He could have stood up to Richard Caldwell, could have said that his grandfather would be at his wedding regardless of what anyone thought, could have drawn a line and defended the man who'd defended him his whole life. He'd chosen not to, and that choice, more than anything Richard Caldwell had said or done, was what really broke my heart. Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy a man's dignity. I've never been the kind of man who resents success. If someone works hard and builds something, more power to them. That's the American way. You earn what you get, and you get what you earn. I respect that. But Richard Caldwell wasn't a man who'd earned respect alongside his money. He was the kind who'd made his fortune and then used it to decide who was worthy of his time and who wasn't. I started asking around. Quiet questions. The kind older men ask when they need information but don't want to seem desperate for it. What I learned didn't surprise me, but it did clarify things. Richard had built his development company from the ground up. I'll give him that much. Started as a general contractor, worked his way into commercial real estate, then luxury residential projects, self-made, which should have meant he remembered where he came from. But some men, once they climb the ladder, kick it down behind them so nobody else can follow. Richard Caldwell was that type. He belonged to the country club. I drove a car worth more than my house, sat on the boards of charities where the real purpose seemed to be networking with other wealthy people, rather than actually helping anyone. His wife Patricia wore jewelry that caught the light from across a room and smiled with teeth too white to be natural. He's the kind of guy who tips exactly 15% and makes sure you know he's calculating it, Frank told me one evening. My cousin worked at a fundraiser he attended, said Caldwell sent back the wine twice because it wasn't expensive enough. Dorothy's husband Jim had dealt with Caldwell on a commercial project years back. Paid his bills on time, I'll give him that, Jim said, but he talked to the workers like they were barely human. Called them the help, even when they were skilled tradesmen. Actions like holding a hammer made you less intelligent than holding a pen. That stung more than I wanted to admit, because I'd held a hammer my whole life, and I'd been proud of it. Proud of what I could build, what I could fix, what I could create from raw materials and honest sweat. But to Richard Caldwell, that made me lesser. Not good enough to stand beside his daughter at a wedding. Not refined enough to be introduced to his social circle. Just old baggage that needed to be quietly disposed of so Tommy could fit properly into his new life. The clearest picture came from a woman named Helen, who volunteered at the same charity as Patricia Caldwell. She pulled me aside after church one Sunday. I overheard Patricia talking about the wedding, Helen said, lowering her voice even though we were alone. She said something about how grateful they are that Tommy is willing to leave his past behind, said he's evolved beyond his raising, and that Emily is a good influence on helping him mature past those old associations. Old associations, like I was a bad habit Tommy needed to break, a phase he'd outgrown, something embarrassing from his youth that didn't fit the narrative of who he was becoming. She also said, Helen hesitated, like she didn't want to hurt me. She said it's for the best that certain family members won't be at the wedding, that it would have been awkward explaining Tommy's situation to their friends. My situation. The situation being that I'd raised him after his parents died, that I'd loved him and provided for him, and turned a tragedy into something survivable. That was the situation Richard and Patricia Caldwell found embarrassing. I thanked Helen and walked to my truck, moving slowly because my legs felt heavier than they had in years, not from age, from the weight of understanding exactly how little I was valued by people who'd never done a damn thing to earn their opinion of me. Richard Caldwell had looked at Tommy and seen potential, seen someone who could be molded, refined, elevated into their world if only he'd shed the remnants of his old life, and he'd convinced Tommy that shedding those remnants meant abandoning the man who'd given him everything. I'd spent 47 years building things that lasted, houses that sheltered families through generations, furniture that would outlive the people who used it. I'd built my life on the principle that what you make with your hands has value because you put yourself into it. But Richard Caldwell dealt in appearances, in image, in the kind of value that exists only because other people agree it exists. And in that world, a 78-year-old carpenter with calloused hands and a modest home was worth less than nothing. He was a liability, a reminder of poverty and struggle and everything their polished, perfect world pretended didn't exist. I couldn't hate him for it. Hate takes energy I didn't have to spare. But I understood him now. Understood exactly what kind of man puts his own daughter's wedding photos ahead of basic human decency. What kind of man measures worth in country club memberships and car values, and who can afford to send back wine that costs more than a week's groceries. The kind of man who builds nothing lasting, who creates no real value, who'll be forgotten 10 minutes after his funeral, because money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy a legacy worth remembering. And that man had convinced my grandson that I was the one who didn't belong. I started to wonder if the boy was fighting a battle I couldn't see. Anger is easy. It's clean. You know who hurt you. You decide they're wrong, and you move forward carrying that clarity like armor. But the truth is rarely that simple. And people are rarely that simple. And the more I learned about what was happening, the more complicated my anger became. Tommy wasn't calling me, but he was calling other people. Or rather, they were overhearing him when he didn't know they were listening. Dorothy's daughter worked at the same engineering firm as Tommy. She came by the house one afternoon, sat at my kitchen table, and told me something that changed how I was seeing this whole situation. "I heard him on the phone in his office last week," she said quietly. "The door was cracked. He was talking to someone, Emily, I think, and he was upset, really upset. I heard him say, 'I don't want to do this, but what choice do I have?' I set down my coffee cup. Did he say what he meant? Not exactly, but he said something about how her father wouldn't help with the down payment for their house if he didn't cooperate. And then he said, 'He's my grandfather. He raised me.' His voice cracked when he said it, Mr. Harlan, like he was trying not to cry. I sat with that for a long moment. Tommy had been looking at houses with Emily for months. They'd found one they loved in a good neighborhood, the kind of place where you could raise kids safely, with good schools and friendly neighbors. But houses like that don't come cheap, especially not on a young engineer's salary. Richard Caldwell had money, the kind of money that could make a down payment happen with a single check, and apparently he'd made it clear that the check came with conditions. "There's something else," Dorothy's daughter said. "I saw him at lunch a few days later. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't been sleeping, and when someone asked him if he was excited about the wedding, he just nodded and changed the subject. The Tommy I know would have been talking everyone's ear off about it. This wasn't exciting. It was, I don't know, resignation, maybe." After she left, I found myself thinking about Tommy differently, not as the grandson who'd betrayed me, but as a young man caught between impossible choices. On one side, his grandfather, the man who'd raised him, who loved him without conditions, who would be hurt but would eventually understand if Tommy explained the situation honestly. On the other side, his future father-in-law, a man with the power to make or break Tommy's financial future, his marriage, his standing in the family he was joining, a man who didn't make requests. He made demands, and you either complied or paid the price. And Emily, the woman Tommy loved, caught in the middle of her father's expectations and her fiancé's loyalty. I'd been thinking of Tommy's choice as simple: stand up for what's right or cave to pressure, black or white. But when you're 24 years old, about to get married, trying to build a life, and someone with money and power tells you that your happiness depends on cutting out the people who remind them of poverty and struggle, that's not simple at all. It's impossible. Frank came by one evening with information from his wife's book club network, the most efficient intelligence operation in town. Apparently, Richard had told Tommy directly that having me at the wedding would send the wrong message to the business contacts and society friends who'd be attending, that Tommy needed to start thinking about his professional image, about the kind of people he associated with publicly. Richard told him that successful people surround themselves with successful people, Frank said. Said Tommy needed to make hard choices about who helped his future and who held him back. The implication was clear. I was holding him back. I was the anchor Richard Caldwell needed cut loose so Tommy could rise to the level where the Caldwells operated. And Tommy, young and in love, and scared of losing everything he'd been promised, had made the choice he thought he had to make. I'm not saying it was the right choice. It wasn't. A man doesn't abandon the people who raised him just because someone with money tells him to. That's not how you build character. That's not how you honor the sacrifices others made for you. But I understood it now. Understood that the boy wasn't cruel. He was trapped, backed into a corner by a man who knew exactly how to manipulate someone's dreams and fears, who knew that young people are vulnerable to promises of security and threats of losing it. My anger at Tommy didn't disappear, but it shifted, softened around the edges, because the real enemy here wasn't my grandson. It was the man who'd put him in a position where he had to choose it all. Some days, a man sits alone with his thoughts, and that's enough. September 20th arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect wedding weather. The kind of day where light filters through leaves just right, and photographs turn out beautiful without even trying. I knew the ceremony was at 2 o'clock, knew it was being held at the country club, under an arbor I'd built with my own hands 4 months earlier, when I still thought I'd be standing beside my grandson watching him start his new life. I woke up at sunrise, same as always, made coffee, sat on the porch and watched the neighborhood come to life. Frank waved from his driveway as he left for his Saturday errands. The young couple across the street loaded their kids into the minivan for what looked like a soccer game. Normal Saturday activities for normal people, living normal lives. I went to work in the garden. Weeds don't care about weddings or heartbreak. They grow regardless, and they need pulling. I spent the morning on my knees in the dirt, hands working soil that had been worked 1,000 times before, finding the kind of peace that only comes from simple, repetitive tasks that require no thinking. At 1:30, I went inside, washed up, and made a sandwich I didn't really want, sat at the kitchen table, and tried not to imagine what was happening 20 minutes away. Tommy putting on his suit, Emily in her dress, probably more beautiful than any bride has a right to be. Guests arriving in expensive cars, dressed in clothes that cost more than my monthly pension. Richard Caldwell played the proud father, shaking hands, accepting congratulations on his daughter's excellent choice of husband. And the arch, my arch, standing there in the late summer sun, holding flowers and greenery, serving as the backdrop for a moment I should have been part of. I'd built it from cedar, the good kind that weathers beautifully and lasts for generations. Mortise and tenon joints, no screws or nails, just wood fitted together the way it's been done for centuries. I'd carved subtle details into the posts, nothing showy, just small elements that would make it unique, meaningful. I'd built it with love, that's the truth of it. Every measurement, every cut, every sanding session had been an act of love for a grandson I thought I'd stand beside while he made promises to last a lifetime. Now, strangers would stand beneath it and have no idea who'd made it, or why. At 2 o'clock, I was sitting on my porch with a glass of iced tea, watching cars pass on the street. I wondered if Tommy was nervous. I wondered if he was thinking about me at all, or if he'd managed to push the guilt down deep enough that it wouldn't show in the photographs. I wondered if Emily knew the whole story, or if she'd been told some sanitized version that made me the problem instead of her father. Mostly, I wondered if this was how things ended, if this was the last chapter of a relationship that had survived tragedy and time and everything life had thrown at us. If the boy I'd raised would move forward into his new life, and eventually, maybe in a few years, I'd just be a name he mentioned occasionally when someone asked about his childhood. My grandfather raised me after my parents died. We're not close anymore. That's simple. That final. The afternoon stretched long and quiet. I didn't cry, didn't rage, didn't call anyone or drive by the country club or do anything dramatic. I just sat there, an old man on a porch, living through a day that should have been one of the best of my life and had instead become one of the loneliest. By evening, I'd seen the photos. Social media is a strange thing. I didn't have accounts myself, but Dorothy did, and she'd seen the pictures posted by guests. She called to ask if I wanted to see them, and I said yes, because not knowing felt worse than knowing. She brought her tablet over. We sat at my kitchen table and scrolled through images of a wedding that looked like something from a magazine. Emily was beautiful. Tommy looked handsome in his suit, smiling in every photo. The venue was elegant. The flowers were perfect. And there, in several shots, was my arch, standing proud and strong, exactly as I'd designed it, with Tommy and Emily framed beneath it as they exchanged vows I hadn't been allowed to hear. "It's beautiful work, Robert," Dorothy said quietly. "Thank you." She squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry you weren't there." I nodded, because words felt too heavy to manage, but I kept looking at those photos, at the arch I'd built, and I felt something unexpected, not bitterness, not even sadness really, something closer to acceptance. I'd done what I could, build something beautiful, because that's what I do. I loved my grandson, because that's what family does. The fact that it hadn't been enough to earn me a place at his wedding didn't diminish what I'd given. It just meant the people deciding who belonged and who didn't had no idea what real value looked like. That evening, after Dorothy left, I sat on my porch again and watched the sun set. Tomorrow I'd wake up and keep living my life, keep tending my garden, keep building things, keep being the man I'd always been, regardless of whether anyone was watching or appreciating it. Because dignity isn't something someone else gives you. It's something you carry yourself, even when you're sitting alone on a day you should have spent celebrating. Especially then, the things we build with our hands often speak louder than words. I didn't hear about what happened at the wedding until 3 days later, when Bill from the hardware store called and asked if I'd talked to anyone who'd been there. No, I said. Why? Because apparently your arch caused quite a stir. I set down the piece of wood I'd been sanding. How so? Bill explained that multiple guests had commented on the wooden arbor, asked where it came from, who'd built it, mentioned how unusual it was to see genuine craftsmanship at a wedding instead of rented decorations or artificial arrangements. Emily's mother, Patricia, had apparently tried to brush off the questions at first, saying it was just something they'd commissioned, but someone, Bill didn't know who, had mentioned that it was made by the groom's grandfather. Then someone else asked why they hadn't met you, Bill said, and things got awkward. Patricia said something about you being unable to attend, but apparently her face said something different. People noticed. Over the next few days, more information trickled in through the small-town network that misses nothing and forgets even less. A woman from Emily's side, someone's aunt who'd driven in from Philadelphia, had examined the arch closely. She dealt in antiques and knew quality when she saw it. She'd commented loudly enough for others to hear that the joinery was masterwork, that whoever built it had decades of experience and real skill. She asked to meet the craftsman, Dorothy told me when she stopped by with more casserole. Patricia told her you couldn't make it to the wedding. The aunt asked why not. Patricia said it was complicated. The aunt said, complicated enough to exclude the man who built this? That seems ungrateful. I felt something shift in my chest. Not vindication exactly, just a quiet acknowledgement that maybe I wasn't invisible after all, that the work I'd done, the care I'd put into every joint and angle, had spoken for me, even when I wasn't there to speak for myself. Frank's wife heard from someone who'd been at the reception that a few guests had started asking questions. Quiet questions, the kind people ask when they sense something isn't right, but don't want to cause a scene. Why isn't Tommy's grandfather here? I thought he raised Tommy after his parents died. Seems strange he wouldn't be at his own grandson's wedding. Richard Caldwell had apparently shut down those conversations quickly, changing subjects with the practiced ease of a man used to controlling narratives. But the questions had been asked. The doubt had been planted. The most telling detail came from an unexpected source, Emily's college roommate, who'd been a bridesmaid. She knew someone who knew Dorothy, and she'd passed along that Emily had seemed uncomfortable every time someone mentioned the arch. She kept saying it was beautiful, the roommate reported, but when people asked about the grandfather who built it, she'd get this look on her face, not angry, sad maybe, like she wanted to say something but couldn't. I thought about that for a long time, about Emily, who I'd met only twice, who'd seemed kind and genuine both times. I wondered if she'd known about her father's ultimatum to Tommy, wondered if she'd agreed with it, or fought against it, or simply gone along because that's what you do when you love someone and you're trying to build a life together. I wondered if she was ashamed, if she'd stood under my arch, speaking words about love and commitment, while knowing that the man who'd built it with love and commitment had been deliberately excluded. The final piece of information came from an unlikely source. Tommy's college friend Marcus, who'd been best man, ran into Frank at the gas station. They'd talked, and Marcus had said something that Frank thought I should hear. Marcus said Tommy seemed off all day, Frank told me. Happy, but not really happy, going through the motions. And when guests asked about the arch, Tommy just said it was handmade and changed the subject. I wouldn't talk about who made it. Marcus thought that was weird, since Tommy used to brag about your carpentry skills all the time. I sat with all this information, piecing together a picture of a wedding where the most commented on element was also the most carefully avoided topic, where my absence had been noted and questioned, even if those questions hadn't led to answers. The arch had done what I couldn't do, shown up and demanded to be acknowledged. Every guest who'd admired it, every person who'd asked where it came from, every moment of uncomfortable silence when people realized the craftsman had been excluded from his own grandson's wedding, all of it was the arch speaking for me, saying, someone loved this boy enough to build something beautiful for his future, saying, quality and care matter, even when the people receiving them don't recognize it, saying, a man's worth isn't measured by his bank account or social status, but by what he creates and who he loves. I'd built that arch to celebrate Tommy's marriage, to honor the family we'd built together from tragedy, to create something lasting that would stand as a testament to love overcoming loss. I never expected it to also stand as a testament to my absence, to become the silent witness to an injustice that other people were finally starting to notice. But maybe that was fitting, because the things we build with our hands, the things we create with love and skill and time, they outlast words, they outlast momentary decisions and social pressure and the opinions of people who measure worth in all the wrong ways. They endure, and sometimes, if we're lucky, they speak the truth when we're not there to speak it ourselves. Sometimes the hardest words to say are, I was wrong. It was a Thursday afternoon in early October when my phone rang. I was in the garage, oiling the hinges on an old cabinet I'd picked up at an estate sale, planning to restore it and donate it to the church, the kind of project that keeps your hands busy and your mind quiet. I almost didn't answer. Unknown number. Probably a telemarketer trying to sell me something I didn't need or warn me about a car warranty I didn't have. But something made me wipe my hands on my work apron and pick it up. Pop? One word. Just one word. And I knew exactly who it was. Knew from the way his voice cracked around the edges, like he'd been holding something heavy for too long, and was finally about to set it down. Tommy. Silence. The kind that stretches out when someone has rehearsed what they want to say, but suddenly can't remember any of it. He stopped. Started again. I need to talk to you. I know I don't have the right to ask, but I need to talk to you. Please. I sat down on my workbench, suddenly aware of how tired I was. Not physically tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying hurt for weeks without knowing when you'll get to set it down. I'm listening, not on the phone. His voice was steadier now, but I could hear the effort it took. Can we meet somewhere? Just you and me. I'll come to you, wherever you want. I need to say some things face to face. Part of me wanted to say no, wanted to tell him that face to face would have been appropriate before the wedding, not after, that you don't get to exclude someone and then demand their time when it's convenient for you. But that's not who I am, never has been. You don't raise a boy from 8 to manhood and then refuse to hear him out when he finally finds the courage to call. There's a diner on Route 30, I said. Miller's, you know it? I know it. Tomorrow, noon. I'll be there. He paused. Pop, thank you for answering, for agreeing to meet. I know you didn't have to. No, I said quietly. I didn't. After we hung up, I sat in the garage for a long time, staring at the cabinet I'd been working on. Funny how you can take something broken and worn and bring it back to useful life with enough time and effort. Sand away the damage, oil the joints, treat it with care. I wondered if that worked with relationships too, or if some breaks went too deep to ever really fix. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd say it, whether I'd be angry or calm, hurt or forgiving. By sunrise, I'd given up trying to plan it. Some conversations can't be scripted. You just show up and see what truth comes out. Friday morning, I dressed carefully. Not my work clothes, but not my Sunday best either. Just clean jeans and a button-down shirt. The kind of outfit that says you respect the occasion without trying too hard. I arrived at Miller's 15 minutes early. Old habit. You show up on time, which means you show up early. I took a booth by the window where I could watch the parking lot, ordered coffee, and waited. Tommy pulled up at 5 minutes to noon. I watched him sit in his car for a full minute before getting out, and I recognized that hesitation. He was gathering courage, preparing himself for something difficult. When he walked through the door and saw me, his face did something complicated. Relief and shame and sadness all mixed together. He looked thinner than I remembered, older somehow, even though it had only been a few weeks, like he'd been carrying weight that showed in ways that had nothing to do with pounds. He slid into the booth across from me, and for a moment we just looked at each other, grandfather and grandson, two men separated by 52 years and a hurt that had seemed impossible a month ago. "Hi, Pop," he said quietly. "Tommy." The waitress came by. Tommy ordered coffee he probably wouldn't drink. We sat in silence while she poured, and I could see him working up to whatever he'd come here to say. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he wasn't quite managing to control. "I was wrong," he said, "about everything, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I nodded slowly, not accepting the apology. Not yet, just acknowledging that I'd heard it. "Tell me what happened," I said. "All of it. No excuses. Just the truth." He took a breath that shook on the way in. "Okay," he said. "Okay." And for the first time since this whole thing started, I was finally going to hear the real story. Sitting across from him, I saw the boy I raised, not the man who hurt me. Tommy wrapped both hands around his coffee cup like he needed something to hold on to. His eyes were red-rimmed, the kind of tired that comes from too many sleepless nights spent replaying your mistakes. "It started about 2 months before the wedding," he began. "Richard, Emily's father, asked to meet with me privately, said it was about future planning. I thought he wanted to talk about career advice or maybe offer some business connections. He's good at that, making you feel like he's doing you a favor." I stayed quiet, letting him talk. He took me to lunch at the country club, expensive place, made a point of introducing me to people, saying I was going to be his son-in-law. Made me feel important, like I was being accepted into something special. Tommy's jaw tightened. Then he got to the real reason he wanted to talk, which was, he said he wanted to have a frank discussion about the wedding, about appearances and expectations. He said Emily was marrying into a certain lifestyle, and I needed to understand what that meant for both of us. Tommy looked down at his coffee. He said successful people surround themselves with successful people. That image matters in his world, that the people you associate with reflect on you. The pieces were falling into place, but I let him continue. "He told me you were a wonderful man," used those exact words, "wonderful man." But he said, having you at the wedding would send the wrong message to his business associates and friends, that they'd look at you and make assumptions about me, about where I came from, about whether I really belonged in their circle. My hands tightened around my own cup, but I kept my voice level. "What kind of assumptions? That I was poor, unsophisticated, that I'd need managing or development to fit into their world properly?" Tommy's voice cracked. He said it wasn't personal, that in a few years, once I'd established myself, once people knew me as an engineer and a professional, it wouldn't matter. But for now, the wedding needed to present the right image. And you believed him. I didn't want to. Tommy looked up at me, and I saw genuine anguish in his eyes. "I argued with him, Pop. I told him you raised me, that you were more of a father to me than anyone, that excluding you was wrong. But he said if I couldn't see the reason for this, he'd have to reconsider helping us with the house, the down payment we were counting on. He said maybe Emily and I needed more time to mature before we were ready for marriage. He made it very clear. Either I played by his rules, or he'd make things very difficult for us." I took a slow breath. So it was about money. It was about control. Tommy's voice turned bitter. He wanted me to prove I'd prioritize his family's expectations over everything else, over you, over my own sense of what's right. It was a test, and I failed it. I chose the easy path instead of the right one. "What about Emily?" Tommy closed his eyes. "Emily didn't know at first. By the time I told her, It was too late to fix it without causing a huge scene. Her mother had already gotten involved, backing up Richard. They told Emily it was for the best, that you'd understand eventually, that successful families sometimes have to make hard decisions. Did Emily agree? She didn't fight it. His voice went quieter. She should have. I should have. We both should have stood up to them. But we didn't. We told ourselves we were being practical, that we were thinking about our future, that you'd forgive us eventually, because that's what family does. I let that sit between us for a moment. The weight of it. The ugly truth of two young people choosing comfort over courage, security over loyalty. You were right about one thing, I said finally. The family does forgive. But Tommy, you have to understand, what you did wasn't just about excluding me from a wedding. You let someone else decide I was an embarrassment. You agreed with them, even if you didn't say it out loud. You chose people who measured your worth by their bank accounts over the man who measured your worth by who you were. I know. Tears were sliding down his face now, and he didn't try to hide them. I know, Pop, and I can't take it back. I can't undo it. All I can do is tell you the truth and hope that someday you can forgive me for being weak when I should have been strong. I looked at this young man sitting across from me, the same boy who'd fallen asleep in my lap during thunderstorms, who'd asked my permission before taking his first girlfriend to prom, who'd called me every Sunday from college without fail. And I saw what I'd missed before. Not a cruel person, not an ungrateful person, just someone who'd been outmaneuvered by a manipulator with more experience and fewer scruples, someone who'd made a terrible choice under pressure and was now living with the consequences. I'm still angry, I said quietly, and I'm still hurt. That doesn't just disappear because you apologized. I know, but I'm listening, and that's more than you gave me before. He nodded, wiping his eyes. There's something else I need to tell you, something I did after the wedding. I waited. I confronted Richard, told him what I thought of his ultimatum and his rules, and his whole twisted view of what matters in life, and I told him we wouldn't be taking his money for the house. A man proves himself not in easy times, but when he rights his wrongs. Tommy's voice was steadier now, like he was finally telling a story he could be proud of instead of ashamed. It was 3 days after the wedding. He continued. Emily and I were at her parents' house for dinner. Richard was holding court like he always does, telling stories about business deals and who he knows, acting like everything was perfect now that the wedding was behind us, and I'd proven I could be reasonable. What did you say? I waited until we were alone, asked to speak with him in his study, very formal, very controlled, the way he likes things. Tommy's jaw set. I told him I knew what he'd done, that forcing me to exclude you wasn't about appearances or helping my future. It was about control, about proving he could make me choose between my past and my future, and that I'd choose whatever he decided was acceptable. I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite pride yet, too early for that, but something close to it. How'd he take it? He tried to spin it, said I was being emotional, that I'd understand when I was older, when I had my own children, when I saw how important it is to set standards and maintain them. Tommy shook his head. I told him I did understand. I understood that his standards were about money and status instead of character and loyalty, and that I wanted no part of them. What about the house? I told him we'd handle it ourselves, that we'd save longer, buy something smaller, do whatever we needed to do without his help. Tommy met my eyes. I told him the price of his money was too high, that it cost me something I should never have been willing to sell, my relationship with the man who raised me. I sat back in the booth, processing this. That must have gone over well. He threatened to cut us off entirely, said Emily would regret marrying someone who didn't understand how the world works, that we'd struggle and eventually come crawling back. Tommy's voice hardened. I told him if that's what we have to do to live with ourselves, then we'll do it. That I'd rather struggle and respect myself than succeed while carrying the shame of what I'd done to you. Emily agreed to this? Tommy nodded. It took some talking, some hard conversations. But yes, she called her mother the next day and told her we were making our own way. Her parents aren't happy, but that's not really my concern anymore. I studied him across the table. This young man who'd buckled under pressure weeks ago was now sitting straighter, speaking with conviction, making choices that would cost him comfort, but earn him something more important. What changed? I asked. The wedding day. Tommy's voice went quiet again, standing under that arch you built, listening to the officiant talk about love and commitment and building a life together. And all I could think was that the man who actually understood those things, the man who'd shown me what they meant through years of action instead of words, wasn't there because I'd been too weak to defend him. He wiped his eyes again. Guests kept complimenting the arch, asking who made it, and I'd mumble something and change the subject because I was ashamed that I was getting married under something you built with love while you sat home alone, because I'd chosen money over you. Tommy? No, let me finish. He leaned forward. Emily and I had our first real fight that night. In the hotel room after the reception, I broke down and told her everything I was feeling, how wrong it was, how I'd betrayed the one person who'd never betrayed me. She cried too, said she'd gone along with it because she didn't want to choose between me and her family, but that choosing not to choose was still a choice. So what now? Now we start over, the right way. Tommy's voice was firm. We're renting an apartment. Small, but it's ours, saving for a house we can afford on our own. Emily's working on setting boundaries with her parents, teaching them that we're adults who make our own decisions, even when they don't like them. And me, I'm hoping, his voice broke, I'm hoping you'll give me a chance to earn back what I threw away. Not all at once. I don't expect that, but slowly, carefully, by proving through action that I've learned what you tried to teach me my whole life, that character matters more than comfort, that loyalty isn't conditional, that the people who love you when you have nothing are worth more than the people who only accept you when you have everything they approve of. I looked at him for a long moment. This boy I'd raised, this man who'd hurt me, this person who was trying, however imperfectly, to find his way back to the values I'd spent 16 years teaching him. You're right, I said finally. You did fail the test. You chose wrong when it mattered most. He nodded, accepting it. But you're also right that what matters now is what you do next, whether you learn from it, whether you become the kind of man who stands up for what's right, even when it costs him something. I want to be that man, Pop, the man you tried to raise me to be. Then be him, I said simply, not just in this moment, while you're feeling guilty and wanting forgiveness, but consistently, when it's inconvenient, when it costs you something, when people with power and money tell you to compromise your values for their approval. I will. We'll see, I said, not cruel, just honest. Time will tell. Wounds heal, but the scars remind us what matters. The conversation at Miller's lasted 2 hours. We talked about everything, what had happened, why it happened, where we went from here. I didn't make it easy on him, and I didn't pretend the hurt would disappear just because he'd apologized and stood up to Richard Caldwell. But I also didn't close the door, because that's not what family does, even when family has failed you. Over the next several weeks, Tommy and I began the slow work of rebuilding. He'd call once a week, usually on Sunday evenings like he used to. We'd talk about his work, about the apartment he and Emily were renting, about small everyday things that have nothing to do with weddings or betrayal. He didn't ask to visit at first, had the wisdom to understand that showing up at my door would feel like pressure, like he was demanding forgiveness on his timeline instead of mine. Instead, he'd ask if I needed anything, if there were projects around the house he could help with, small offers of service that didn't require me to give anything back except permission. After a month, I told him he could stop by, help me finish restoring the cabinet I'd been working on when he first called. He showed up with coffee and donuts, just like we used to do on Saturday mornings when he was young. We worked side by side in the garage, sanding and measuring and fitting pieces together. Didn't talk much. I didn't need to. Sometimes the best communication happens in shared silence while your hands do useful work. Emily came with him on the second visit. She stood in my doorway looking nervous, holding a homemade pie and an apology that spilled out before I'd even invited her inside. "Mr. Harlan, I'm so sorry. I should have fought harder. I should have stood up to my parents. Should have made sure you were at the wedding because you deserved to be there. I was weak, and I let someone I love get hurt because of it, and I'm truly, deeply sorry." I looked at this young woman, pretty, sincere, clearly terrified I'd reject her the way her family had rejected me, and I saw something I respected, genuine remorse, not the kind that's performed to make yourself feel better, but the kind that costs something to express. "Come in," I said. "Both of you." We sat in my living room, the three of us, and talked like adults. Emily told me about growing up with Richard and Patricia, about the constant pressure to present a perfect image, about learning that love in their family came with conditions and expectations. She said meeting Tommy had shown her something different, someone who valued character over status. But that old habits died hard. "I'm learning," she said quietly, "learning to stand up to them, learning that disappointing them isn't the worst thing that can happen, that disappointing myself and people like you who've earned respect is much worse." I appreciated her honesty, appreciated that she didn't make excuses or try to minimize what had happened, just owned it and committed to doing better. Over the following months, the three of us developed a new rhythm: dinners every other week, holiday plans that included me, small moments of connection that slowly rebuilt what had been broken. Tommy and Emily's apartment was modest, 2 bedrooms in an older building, nothing fancy, but it was theirs, earned by their own work instead of purchased with Richard Caldwell's conditional approval. They were proud of it, and I was proud of them for choosing it. I met them there one evening, and Tommy showed me around like a kid showing off a good report card, pointed out the used furniture they'd refinished, the curtains Emily had sewn herself, the small vegetable garden she was attempting on their narrow balcony. "It's not much," Tommy said, "but it's honest. Honesty is enough," I told him. "Honesty is what lasts." The forgiveness came gradually, not all at once, not with some dramatic moment of reconciliation, just slowly, over time, through consistent action that proved Tommy meant what he'd said, that he'd learned from his mistake, that he valued loyalty over comfort and character over status. By Christmas, when they came to my house for dinner, things felt almost normal, almost like before. The wound had closed, even if the scar remained visible. We sat around my kitchen table, the same table where Tommy had done his homework as a kid, where I'd told him his parents had died, where years of life had unfolded, and shared a meal I'd cooked myself. Nothing fancy, just pot roast and vegetables and pie for dessert. "Thank you," Emily said as we cleared the dishes, "for giving us another chance, for not shutting us out when you had every right to." I shook my head. "Family doesn't work that way, or it shouldn't. You make mistakes, you own them, you do better. That's how people grow." Tommy stood at the sink, washing dishes like he'd done 1,000 times as a kid, and I saw something in his posture that hadn't been there at the wedding. Confidence, not the false kind that comes from money or status, but the real kind that comes from knowing who you are and what you stand for. He'd made a terrible choice, had hurt someone who loved him, had chosen wrong when it mattered most, but he'd also done something harder than making the right choice in the first place. He'd admitted he was wrong, paid the price to make it right, and committed to being better. That takes a different kind of strength, the kind you can't fake, the kind that comes from genuine character instead of pressure or image or what other people expect. As they were leaving that night, Tommy hugged me at the door, held on a little longer than usual. "I love you, Pop," he said quietly, "and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving I meant it when I said I'd do better." "I know you will, son. I know you will." I watched them drive away, Emily's hand in Tommy's. 2 young people learning what it means to build a life on values instead of appearances. The hurt hadn't disappeared, probably never would completely, but it had transformed into something else, a reminder of what matters, a lesson in both failure and redemption, a scar that proved we'd survived something that could have destroyed us. And sometimes, that's the best you can hope for. Not perfection, not erasure of the past, just honest healing and the wisdom that comes from pain turned into growth. That's enough. That has to be enough, because that's what family is. messy and imperfect and worth fighting for, even when fighting means forgiving what seemed unforgivable. Especially then. That conversation at Miller's Diner happened 8 months ago now. These days, Tommy calls every Sunday evening, just like he did back in his college years. He and Emily come by most weekends. We work on projects in the garage, share meals around my kitchen table, and rebuild what was broken, one honest day at a time. The scar is still there. Some days I feel it more than others, but it's become a reminder of what really matters, that a foundation built on love and showing up can survive just about anything. Manipulation, weakness, even betrayal, if people are willing to come back and do the hard work of making it right. Tommy learned the hard way that character always costs something, that loyalty isn't convenient, that the people who stand by you when you have nothing are worth far more than anyone who only accepts you once you've met their standards. And maybe that's the lesson I want to leave you with today. Family isn't perfect. People stumble. Sometimes they fall hard. But what defines us isn't the mistake. It's whether we get back up, own what we did, and choose to do better. If this story touched you, moved you, or made you think about someone in your own life, hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want to hear more real-life lessons about family, loyalty, forgiveness, and standing firm when the world tries to bend you. And please, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, whether you've ever had to forgive something big, or how you would have handled being in Tommy's shoes. I read every one, and it reminds me I'm not talking into the void. Take care of yourselves out there. Hold tight to the people who matter. Protect your dignity. It's yours to carry, no matter what anyone else says. God bless you all. I'll see you in the next one.